Alright folks, before I go and get to the spicy demo here, as you can see, I've got a scene that we're going to add a post-process volume to, and we're going to do a workup just to get it looking pretty okay. This scene was originally a UE4 scene. There's been a lot of converting done to it to get it lit in Lumen, so don't be discouraged. This is just an incredibly high quality scene using a lot of really good art techniques, and the post-processing is going to be probably the most important element of bringing it all together, and I'll do some demonstrations in it when I get a chance here. However, we do need to break down the basic one. So let's go ahead and bring one in the world right now. I'm just going to go ahead and grab a post-process volume. Now, I forget where that's located. Typically, I always find it, but we can go to All Classes, or it should be in Volumes, and it'll be listed under Post-Process Volume. Alright. I'm just going to bring this out into the world here so we can go ahead and play around with it. I'm going to the Details panel. And I'm going to make sure that I'm in the correct kind of size here so we can see what's going on. Alright. So, let's go ahead and talk about some of these different elements from lens, color grading, film, global illumination, reflections, rendering features, post-process volume settings, replication, which is network based, so we don't have to worry about that, brush settings, world partition, which we don't have to worry about in this demo, HLOD, which we don't have to worry about, and actor, we don't have to worry about. This is just dealing with how it looks in the world. Make sure we're looking at all the right things here. Alright, so let's start at the top and I'll go ahead and explain each setting here. So, lens is essentially what is going to happen at the lens level. Each of these different effects affects the way that the lens is viewing the game world. The top setting here, mobile depth of field, is typically used for mobile games. What it is a depth of field, or what can I say? Yeah, it's pretty much depth of field, but for mobile games. Mobile games can actually handle some depth of field. We don't want to worry too much about using this one particularly because we were on the PC platform, but if the word mobile is in it, you can expect it to work for a mobile platform. Let's go ahead and close that now and just move on to the next setting. Now, I'm going to leave this post-process volume kind of the same size. It is a brush, so because it's a brush, it does have the same size constraints as your typical brush, which allows you to change the size and value of things. The same way that you were able to manipulate a brush in the world using BSPs. BSPs are just brushes. This is also just a brush. I'm going to increase the size of our volume. And I move it up, and I'm going to press the end key to stomp it down, and we'll play around with it here shortly. So let's make sure we're starting in the correct spot here so I don't fly into it. It'll be over here. Okay. Let's see if we can make it visible. Note we would have to throw it into a blueprint to make it visible. It doesn't want to work that way. We'll just make sure it's straight ahead of us, and then we'll put something underneath it to showcase that it's in front of us. Oh, that's good enough, I think. Okay, let's go ahead and go back up, take a look. All the options are open now, obviously, because that's kind of just what happens when you're working in it. So let's go ahead and close mobile depth of field. Let's look at bloom. So bloom is pretty straightforward. It has a significant amount of options that you can control when you are using bloom. So for example, something that you can do is, let's go ahead and turn on the initial method here, and let's go ahead and I'm going to go ahead and crank the intensity to something disgusting, and let's go ahead and very quickly hit play, and we'll walk into it. And we'll see that the bloom lighting is going to be based on exactly what the settings are set in here. We don't really need to worry about too many different types of methods. Standard method is totally fine. And by setting up your intensity to be higher than kind of the average, you're going to get like some very, very harsh lighting conditions. So a good amount of setting for this, for example, which I'll demonstrate in the next section of this demo, is going to go ahead and set it to these low values, for example. Setting low values and setting at least a not negative positive, something like 0.35, is usually a good way to start manipulating the bloom to be a little bit more comfortable. This looks a lot better when you actually have a lot of different lights. So let's actually go ahead and throw a light in here so we can see what's going on. So we'll place an actor. And we'll do a spotlight. It's going to be kind of tough to see sometimes, especially if the effect is not super strong. But we'll crank that effect so we can see what's going on. Make sure we're in the correct direction here. Moving this in the red direction, forward. And then I'm just going to go ahead and increase the candle power here. Let's hit play. Not necessarily getting a good result here. Let's see if we can change this a little bit differently to get a better color. And we'll lower the ambient light. And then we'll mess with the bloom intensity a little bit, just to get the result a little bit stronger, because unfortunately it's just hard to see when we don't have a lot of lights in the scene. And then we'll throw the threshold down a little bit, so we'll just add it a little bit back. Hit play. I apologize for the graphical errors there, folks. But you can see that the bloom is having somewhat an effect. We can see that it does affect kind of the way that the crispness of the light looks on the ground. We have our default light here. If we return the default lights to the regular color, I think we'll be okay. Let's go ahead and return the lumen value back to that. We'll hit play. So again, you see how the bloom affects globally what the lighting is going to do. It'll be a little bit better looking once I actually spent a little bit of time looking at what the showcasing what the example is going to look like. But let's go ahead and go back to the post-process volume here, so we can go ahead and move on to different settings here. Let's set these back to default. Now, there's a bunch of advanced settings that you can set. I'll be honest, I do not mess too much around with this. What this allows you to control, if we go ahead and use convolution kernel, which we don't have, this allows you to change different things like the size scale. This allows you to change the variety of tint colors that you can have in the bloom lighting. For example, let's see if I can throw a different bloom color in there. And then we'll use the default intensity here, and then we'll see if we can move in here. So we see that it does have a cumulative effect. We can add additional colors as well. And these colors all generally mix to create a final effect of what the overall tint is going to look like. You can see that we have some harsh greens in there, but we still have some elements of red in the bloom lighting. I don't generally mess around with this too much, mostly because this controls a lot of what the bloom is going to do. And we can control the size of the different bloom. I'm going to change the size scale here and just kind of manipulate what the bloom is actually doing more precisely. There is a lot to kind of cover related to just adding different types of bloom lighting. Let's go ahead and kind of manipulate this. So each of these use a different bloom setting, and it changes based on the screen width. And then each of those screen widths, there's overall 6 widths that you can control in terms of bloom lighting that allow you to control ultimately what each drop down is going to add. So you can see like kind of a global bloom. We have kind of midtones. We have kind of like the halftones. And then we have the glow tones. We also have the general size of the actual mesh. And then we have the overall size of the bloom itself at the camera space. So we can see how this overall affects how the bloom is going to operate in our scene. So it's really easy to start losing the plot when it comes to adding a bunch of different types of lighting when it comes to bloom. Let's go ahead and go back to our other scene really quickly, and I'll set up some bloom, and then we'll go from there. So let's go ahead and look at this scene for a sec. And I'm going to go ahead and change the visualizer. So I was just looking at the visualizing feature for Lumen. And this is what the scene looks like. Yes, there are some graphical hitches on it that has to do with the graphics card. Don't worry about that. It's just an issue with Lumen. We're just going to try to solve the issue of the lighting, and then we can troubleshoot our Lumen final gather quality and see if we can solve some of those issues. Now, there is no post-process volume in here. I'm going to go ahead and create one. Let's go into volumes, and then we'll go into post-process volume. We'll drag this bad boy in here. We're not going to be able to see him because everything's just kind of shut off. So we have our post-process volume. And I'll just leave that right there because I'm not going to worry about whether or not it's placed precisely. Let's hit G to make sure that I can turn everything off. And we've got a post-process volume. I'll leave that alone for now. And then I'm going to go into a detail panel. Okay, that's selected properly. To make sure it's actually in the scene. Oh, let's go to details panel. All the results as filters. Oh, I put this in the wrong spot. That's why it's not showing up. Alright, got it working. Alright, let's go ahead and set up some settings here. So I'm going to mess around with the bloom initially, and then we'll add some elements as we go, and I'll talk about what they're each doing. So, I'm just going to turn this setting on because I'm a little bit paranoid whether or not it's actually going to work or not. So I'll do that, and then I'm just going to add a couple of changes. I wanted to see if this actually makes an effect, so let's go ahead and throw some on there. I'm just going to throw some occlusion in here so I can see if the result is going to do anything. And if not, doesn't look like it is, I'll just go ahead and leave it off for now. To make sure that the occlusion setting is set properly. That's fine. Alright, let's go ahead and hop to bloom here. I'm just going to add a little bit of value here. I'm going to set the default method, which is standard. And then I'm going to set the intensity and the threshold. I'm going to set the intensity to something like 3. Oh, I forgot. We should really have the post-process volume set to infinite extents unbound. There we go. Alright. That might be a little bit too much, but we can always go back and set it up a little bit differently. And I'm just going to throw a number in there to see if I can get that bottom to come up a little bit. Let's see if that mobile depth of field actually did do something. Nope. Okay. So it's that simple. You could, in theory, go in here and start adding different colors. Like, for example, if we wanted to add a tint to this to make it kind of like more, you know, more like, I guess if you wanted to say, you can see how it's affecting our overall shine in the distance. Add kind of like a more New York subway vibe. Or let's add a 610 here. There, everybody see kind of that effect overall. But I'm not going to do that. I'm going to keep this as simple as possible, and I'm going to stay away from the advanced settings. Most of you guys are beginners. It's a little bit less complicated if I just kind of leave this alone. Okay. Let's go ahead and go back to the other project for now. I'm going to save this, and I'm going to go back and forth between this project and the other so that I can show kind of how all of this is working when it's done. Okay. Let's go back to the other project here. I like how I killed the skylight, and the skylight is really upset. Let's go ahead and find it. It's under the ground, isn't it? I hate how they do that. Holding down shift to move it up. Okay. And I'm going to set the skylight to 3.14. There we go. That gives us a little more comfortable lighting. Okay. Let's go ahead and click on the post-process volume again. And I'm going to go ahead and turn off some of these settings here because we don't really need them. Again, just showcasing some of the elements that we had previously. Alright. We already kind of know how exposure works. We've only ever really played around with some of the exposure settings in relation to some of the different modes, especially when it comes to min and max brightness. Let me just go ahead and very quickly explain what the most important element inside of the post-process volume is for this. It's going to be your exposure compensation. This is going to allow you to control the exposure inside of the volume if you need additional power for a scene. This is manual exposure. This is not auto exposure. What this does is it allows you to change the exposure and drive the exposure a lot higher. This is the exposure compensation you need to worry about the most. Let's also talk about min and max brightness. We've talked about this before in the past, dealing with the eye adaptation. We can actually visualize that. Visualize HDR eye adaptation. And if we go ahead and change the exposure compensation, we see how the min and max brightness clamp to try, albeit again try, this is our min and this is our max right here, to try to figure out how to best change the way that our eye is working. So again, minimum brightness has to do with how wide our eye gets. Maximum brightness has to do with how squint our eye gets in max brightness. So if we lower that too much, we lose a lot of that high range and it becomes brighter. But this, a higher number here will tolerate more light. That's more or less the wisdom. If we bring this particular one up, we can tolerate less of a change. Although typically speaking, when I'm looking at using exposure compensation to figure out how dark or how light my scene is supposed to be, I'm going to go into the darkest area and set my min brightness, and then I'm going to go into the brightest area and set my max brightness. For the project that you guys are typically working on and the kind of light levels that you guys are working on, again, there's such a narrow range of light that is in your scene that it might not actually make too much of a difference to leave this other than the default. Most of the time, people want to change the speed up and speed down of the eye adaptation. Honestly, if you're making a scene for a game and you don't require eye adaptation, turn this off. 9 times out of 10, we see what the effect has on the scene, right? 9 times out of 10, you'll find it that it's more problematic than anything else. I've already explained it in the past. We don't have to worry too much about that. However, the important ones that people really like to actually work with is the speed up and speed down. I typically will set these to 4. Mostly because I just want my eye to adapt as fast as possible. I mean, it could be faster, obviously, but I just want it to adapt at something that I think is going to be more likable in terms of being able to see where I'm supposed to go. Eye adaptation is supposed to be an effect that it looks good, and it's supposed to simulate your eye, but it doesn't really. I'm not a huge fan of that. Let's not worry about low and high percentage. This deals with some more elements of controlling the exposure. I'm going to go ahead and close these, and then we'll move on to the next thing. Turn off our exposure compensation. Chromatic aberration. This one's fun. For chromatic aberration, it's actually as simple as turning on the intensity and just cranking it up. That's it. Your start offset controls the amount of offset that you get and where the center of the camera generally is located. I don't necessarily like messing with start offset. All you really kind of want is to set an intensity here. I usually like setting an intensity of anywhere from 2 to 5. Usually a 3 will work just fine. And gives a nice kind of comfortable chromatic aberration. But also you got to think about how the exposure is going to affect the way that this chromatic aberration looks. This works best on stills. The more value you have here, the uglier things are going to be. Let's go ahead and turn that off. Okay. Let's go ahead and close chromatic aberration. And let's go ahead and talk about a dirt mask. So I'm going to see if I can find one here. Give me a minute to pause and see if I can find a dirt mask that I can use. Aha, there is one in the engine content. Okay, so all you need to do to find this particular one is if you go into settings for your content browser, and you'll want to go ahead and show engine content, and then you'll want to look in the engine content itself right here. Or you can look in C++, that's not anything in there. And then we have a texture that we can use. I'm going to go ahead and dock this temporarily. And I'm going to turn on this dirt mask. And actually, let's see if we can find it. There it is. Cool. Now I'm going to go ahead and close the content browser here. And I'm going to go ahead and turn off my visualizer here. And we're going to go ahead and turn on the dirt mask intensity. And I'm just going to crank this up so we can see it. See if I can get a result here. Fate favors the bold. There we go. This is what a dirt mask is. Let's go ahead and change the texture color so we can see what it's actually doing. Change to something like really obnoxious that we can actually see. Whoop. Brighter values are easier to see. There we go. Yellow. Looks okay. Bring this up all the way. So does everybody see what's on screen? It's almost like there's something attached to the camera, right? Now, this can be animated, and this can be put. This is where you get kind of like our blood sprays. It's a little bit different because it's handled through UMG, but what the dirt mask can do is the dirt mask allows you to add a certain percentage of dirt to the screen, and it is really just a texture. Yep, just an HDR texture. That's all it is. You can find or make a bunch of dirt masks. It's actually pretty straightforward. All it is an alpha image. Actually, it's not even an alpha image anymore. It used to be. It looks like just a standard RGB image. Let's go ahead and see if we can find it. It should just be a texture, but let's go ahead and see if we can explore it a little bit more. No, bitmaps, world. No alpha channel. Yeah, it's just a layer that reads as though white is visible and black is invisible. And by default, the dirt mask texture will add those elements to the screen. Let's see if we can add more value in here. There we go. So you see kind of how that works. That's being applied to the screen space, and it's widescreen format, so it's going to be important to make sure that you at the very least are using at least the widescreen resolution, which I believe is 2048 by 124 in this particular image. Again, artists, if you want to make your own, that's a good example, but a dirt mask is what you would apply to your scene to kind of apply that kind of gritty, like, oh, it's, we're in a rainstorm. It looks great for stills. You might want something more animated. It has its own bokeh, as you can see, but this is faked. This is just a dirt mask. It adds a little bit to the scene to kind of make it pop, right? We'll add a little bit to the subway scene when we get back to it here. Sorry about the cut there, folks. I needed to take a little break because I've been doing this for a few hours now. But no worries, let's keep going. So for those of you who missed out, turning off my dirt mask. We just covered dirt mask. Let's go ahead and talk about camera. Now, camera doesn't work by default. If we turn these settings on, we see that these settings don't necessarily have an effect immediately. Nothing's actually going to happen here. In order to get this camera working, we actually have to go up to exposure, and we have to change our metering mode to manual. And now that we have the correct amount of metering, or rather, now that we have our metering mode turned on for a manual, do these settings actually make a difference? Let's go ahead and go back up for a second. Let's take a look at the exposure compensation. So we need to actually physically change the exposure compensation up here. And let's take a look at a couple of settings that I think I can use here. Yes, we'll apply physical camera exposure. We're not going to use anything here. Let's use a metering mask. This will be fine. We won't worry about that. Now that should give us something that we can work with. There we go. So this is more for people who understand more the camera settings and like physical camera settings. I technically don't. I'm not a photographer. Let's see, shutter speed 60. I think I set this to 100 ISO for aperture with a 1.25 fat fingering and number of blades. So you see how the control is handed off to the camera once we are inside of the post-process volume. I don't necessarily understand this one too well. Mostly because if I'm going to do any kind of exposure settings, I'll work predominantly in pure exposure. This deals mostly with your manual camera settings. If you are going to be setting manual camera settings and you understand the filmic approach to setting things like shutter speed, if you're a photographer, this might be something that you actually appreciate. Your exposure compensation obviously being your logarithmic adjustment. Let's go ahead and scroll back up. So we've got an exposure compensation up here. Let's set that to like a value that I can work with here. I've got this manual setting. Let's do. I'm going to turn on all these settings as well because I kind of want them. 1, 3. We'll do our. Okay, so these are turned on. That's fine. Worry about our curve here. It's hard to tell because we have lumen turned on, so we might just need more light in the scene. But you get the idea. This allows us to control our exposure using camera tools. So if you understand shutter speed, ISO, aperture, f-stop, which is just exposure, again, aperture is the size of the opening, if I remember correctly. ISO is the camera sensor sensitivity. Shutter speed is the speed of the camera in seconds. I just threw some elements in here that I know work to activate this. I do not like using the camera to set this up, but if you are a photographer or if you are somebody who is working with a director or you're working with someone who is working with photography, this starts leading into virtual production. We don't cover too much of that in this particular class. However, this is the doorway to virtual production. Let's see if we can get a better result here. Let's override the viewport here. Let's go to default game settings and let's turn the EV100 up and down depending on what we want. Let's see, that's not going to have an effect now because we're overriding it with the camera settings. No big deal. Let's, oh, I've lost my mouse for some reason. That's not good. Give me a moment to restart this virtual machine here, folks. That way I can actually see my mouse again. Alright, it looks like the mouse cursor is back. Good, good, good. Okay. So let's go ahead and reset that. I'm going to set the game settings for what we had previously. And then we'll go back to our post-process volume. And then we'll reset our values here. We can see how that has a very profound effect on the camera itself. Again, f-stop. And frankly, there might not be. This works a lot better when there isn't enough light, or when there is enough light in the scene. our light is not very powerful in this scene. You would kind of want to use more of these settings if you were lighting physically accurate lighting, which means that your sunlight would be something like 15 to 20,000 lumens, 24,000 up to 60,000 lumens. Yeah, this is what you would want to use if you were going to be physically accurate about your sun. You don't need to be physically accurate about your sun. Let's just go ahead and move on. Again, these are not my favorite settings. I don't like using them in particular, mostly because, again, they are used specifically to generate a realistic lighting scenario, but our light is not set up to a realistic lighting mode. Like, our light would be something like 24,000 lumens. And then we have enough light to actually start using the camera settings. Let's go ahead and set this back to 3.14. And then let's keep going. Let's go back to the post-process volume. Okay. Let's keep going. And then I'll go back to the other scene when I can. Camera. All right. Lens flares. Everybody loves lens flares, right? Do we have a... Yeah, do we have enough light in this scene? This might be a little bit more visible. We already showcased lens flares in the other example, but I'm going to go ahead and turn this on anyway. Let's go ahead and see if we can have like lens flares. There we go. And this is based on the light that you have in the scene, so by turning on the intensity, you see we have lens flares. And also we can change things like the tint color. We can change things like the bokeh size. We can change the threshold at which the bokeh is going to be visible. Lower threshold is not generally a good idea, but this is hard to tell when you have like only one solid effect. So this is a minimum brightness that it needs. Obviously the sun has almost infinite brightness. This controls essentially the minimum brightness of when the lens flares are going to have an effect. This is a default number, that's good. Let's go ahead and see if we can find a bokeh shape. Looks like they only have a 5-sided. Let's see if they have a bokeh. Bokeh. A textured bokeh. Why not? Let's see, that's the default bokeh shape, I think. Does it have any texture to it? Let's turn it up a little bit and see if we can get it cleaned up a little bit. Alright. Oh, click that off. Sorry about that. Reset that. Might be a little hard to tell because the bokeh can get a little bit wild here. We are getting a result, but it is being slightly overridden by everything else that we had. Let's see if I have a good setting for that off the top of my head. Don't think I do. Let's see here. This becomes a little bit more manageable when you have more lights. The sun is going to generate its own bokeh, but again, this just gives you kind of a good idea for what the shapes of your bokeh is going to look like. It can be a little hard to tell with this. We'll tell a little bit more when we actually get into the other scene, when we're testing out the bokeh. But again, lens flares. If you want lens flares, this is how you get lens flares. Pretty straightforward. Let's go ahead and close that up. I'll play with that here in the next scene. Image effects. Vignetting and like whatnot for fun stuff. That's really it. That's all there is to it. We get some grain jitter. This is harder to tell, I think. There we go. So this adds a little bit of graininess to your scene. I don't know why you would want that. Let's add a value of 2 maybe. There we go. But it adds kind of like a cinematic feel. I don't know why people would want that, but it goes in line with all the other effects that we've talked about. And then of course grain intensity, I'm going to throw like a value in there. And this is film grain. Well, not necessarily the kind of film grain that you would want. Let's turn off the film grain and set this to a value of like 1. It's kind of a generic grain. If you wanted your own film grain, you would have to kind of make your own. Yes, there are standards for film grain, for what film grain you're going to be using in your movies and whatnot. I know Shrek had a very specific film grain. But again, like, I don't know why you would want this effect, but just know that this effect exists. And again, it only exists while we are inside the post-process volume. You guys saw in the demo a few weeks ago how I made a film grain using a moving texture with some panners. This is just kind of the easy version of doing it. You would actually have a file that would work to do the correct kind of graining if that was your thing. Turn off the vignetting, let's turn off the grain intensity, and let's close that. And let's go ahead, depth of field. This might be a little hard to tell. Let me actually go ahead and make some room here. Snip, snap. Let's do, there we go. Too much. We'll destroy a third person. And then we will set this to start player at current camera location. And then we'll fly back. Okay. And then we'll grab some of these elements here. I'm just going to shift click them. Move them over. Again, I'm just trying to create a depth in the scene so that we can actually see what this is doing. Alright, cool. So go ahead and hop back into the volume here so we can see what the effect is going to be like. Now again, not my favorite effect. When we talk about sequencer, we'll talk about it a little bit more. But I'm inside the depth of field. And I hate to say that the value of depth of field is reliant on several things. If you're going to be using depth of field, you have to, I hate this. Let's go back into camera. And this is why it pays to kind of know what you're looking at here. So you don't have to worry about reflections here. Let's go back into camera. We have to enable these settings down here. Set these to a core value here. And then our depth of field it will theoretically work with these values. Again, theoretically. Because most of these settings, let's go ahead and set this focal distance to 0. And set this value to 1. And let's see if I can actually get a result. Let's see here. No, I want to go back to the default settings that I had. Okay. This is a lot easier in the actual cinematic camera. Mostly because this is, again, an effect that appears in the camera itself. And there's not a whole lot of depth that we have here. Again, this kind of simulates a certain depth of field. As soon as we get out of it, we see kind of how that depth of field works. This is like 30, I think. Give us a result. You see, with the proper blending, you could get a depth of field effect. Honestly, if you're using this effect inside of the post-process volume, I think you're making a mistake. The Cine camera which we'll talk about in the future. Should be under cinematics. The Cinecamera actor. Did I not bring it into the scene? Oh, let's turn off that value. Has its own film depth of field. I strongly recommend that if you want depth of field, set it up in the camera. Don't set it up in the post-process volume. I am not a fan of setting up depth of field in the post-process volume, mostly because it's a generalized effect as opposed to being precise, and it doesn't get modulated, right? This only showcases a very specific depth of field for a certain distance. That's kind of it. The camera itself will do your ramping depth of fields. I don't know why you would want to use depth of field inside of the post-process volume, but just know that it is a thing that exists, and that it exists just to make you unhappy. I don't like it. I don't think it's good. Okay. All right. So that more or less covers the lens section. I know this is going to get kind of boring, obviously, because we have a few other sections to go. But I'm only really going to talk about color grading, film, and that'll be about it. So in the next demo, we're going to stop talking about lens, and we're going to start talking about color grading. And a demo after that, we'll start talking about film. And then I'll just go ahead and finish the other demo, and then we'll go from there. All right? So for those of you watching, I'll probably move the subway lighting to the third video here. I know I was doing some work in it earlier. I'll go ahead and talk through that and reset it, but I think this will look pretty sick once we're done. Let's see what this is looking like already. This is already looking pretty good. I might want to mess around with that a little bit. But, okay, this has been a demo on post-process lensing. Let's go ahead and talk a little bit more in the next demo about the different elements of the post-process volume, and then we'll go from there. I apologize that this seems really dry, but post-processing is not fun. It's just a soundboard with a bunch of different buttons that have an effect on the scene as a whole. And then I'll do this demo when we're done, and I think that'll kind of coalesce everything into how you can get really good at post-processing and visual effects inside of Unreal and make some really cool looking things. I will see you guys in the next video.